Welcome to the Sensible Socialist podcast, a podcast for the rational left.
We need to unite and work together if we're all going to get through this. Sounds like socialism to me.
The amount of people I see talking about socialism positively is actually staggering.
Do you think, do you really think that a proletarian revolution is just around the corner in America?
Grab your pitchforks and stab your mayor.
Your hero, Obama.
He's not my hero. I'm
How
not
heroic
fucking
he
idiot.
comes
If Bernie Sanders were president, right, and he wanted to bring the same ideas as for socialism into this country, do you think that we would benefit?
Yeah.
But I just told you Venezuela's eating rats.
But I just want people to have health care. I don't want,
Same thing Hugo Chavez.
oh my god. You people have, worms in your brain, honestly.
Welcome to the Sensible Socialist podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Gustafson. And in this episode, we're having a second part or a part two conversation with a listener of the podcast who reached out after they heard my conversation with Destiny. And this one is less focused on specifically socialism, though I think it talks about that. And it's more about cooperatives and how we can advance cooperatives at scale, and a number of different issues. So without further ado, here's my conversation with a listener, part two.
Great.
All right, well...
So where did we... go for it.
I wanted to ask you, I wanted to make sure there wasn't anything that maybe you felt was left on the table in terms of the specifically sort of political socialist stuff, because I know you wanted to talk about, and you had questions specifically about the co-op stuff. And so I wanted to make sure that, didn't leave anything on the table, but what the kind of questions or things that you wanted to talk about in terms of the specifically co-ops and how that fits into my kind of way I look at it, and anything like that.
Yeah, good call. I remember the last time we spoke, we touched on co-ops a little bit, and I know that's your favorite thing, and I was keen to talk about it, but we ran out of time because we talked about everything else as well.
Yeah.
Which was pretty funny. But I had heaps of stuff I wanted to talk to you about, and most of them were functional questions around how you could make a co-op system work in a society where you have mandated that and correct me if I'm wrong at any time, mandated that either someone has to work for the government or they have to work for a co-op, and they can't work for a private business that has private property. Is that correct?
I think that that would be, in some ways end stage situation where you've got a situation where you've grown the cooperative economic sector so that you've got a working class that is an organized working class represented by a kind of political party that has captured the political system. I would say possibly through a legitimate legal electoral process, depending on what the situation was, that in terms of any kind of political devolution, maybe it would have to be a less kind of traditionally bourgeois democratic kind of capture of power. But in whatever way, there's going to be a capture of power of a specifically organized political organization, political party, that has as its goal ultimately the transfer of power, I might say, from the traditional ruling elite, the owners and controllers of capital, into the hands of the workers. And so that like you were saying, is either going to be through public organizations. I would think that you'd want something that sort of anything that we might consider infrastructure or basic rights. So the provision of food, housing, electricity, transportation, those kind of things should be in some ways subject to public at minimum sort of input, but kind of whatever we might want to call control. And we can think of different structures that might allow sufficient input of people who are interested and actually want to participate in those kind of decision making. But then in terms of overall economically, you would ultimately make in the United States and even in most constitutional systems, a sort of constitutional, either you come up with a new constitution that specifically says that that traditional private property in the sense of private ownership of the means of production is not a legitimate form of protected property right, and so then you'd have a system that would transfer the ownership of enterprises from individual or even collective corporate ownership into a different kind of collective ownership, and that would, in my view, hopefully and primarily be a worker cooperative. You could envision it being potentially less and some kind of, there's people who argue a more kind of Yugoslav model where you might have the state even claiming sort of ownership of businesses, but then would have worker self-management, so that it would the government would essentially hold in trust like the actual ownership and title, if it wouldn't really be title, but what we think of as title to the what was formerly private capital, and then it would just allow workers to decide what to do with that capital, and if they're able to generate more capital, they can decide what to do with it and things like that. But I think the you're going to have a situation where you're going to have small enterprises of a couple people or even a single person doing something, and so you're going to have what almost look like former private ownership businesses, but once you get into a situation in which you have a collection of people, that there has to be at least a co-ownership and or co-control model of those organizations. And so there's still an internal freedom in terms of how that would be structured within each organization, allowing workers to choose the kind of enterprise that they want to go to in terms of maybe the level of participation that is either offered or demanded. But I think in principle it would be the sort of legalization and the putting in place of a system that would demand the same thing that we do in our political system, which is that if you are involved in something and it affects you, then you have the right to at minimum participate in the decisions of that organization. And in some ways, like, to get super cooperative worldy, that would go move outside of even enterprises. That would certainly be enterprises. I think that'd be a primary way, but you'd think schools and cities and even sort of city blocks and things like that, you could have cooperative organizations that allow people, don't force people, but allow people, if they are so inclined, to participate in discussions and to have a vote and to be able to again more meaningfully participate in their communities and their enterprises and their world.
So this kind of, your earlier part of that statement kind of feeds into some of the concepts that I'm struggling with when it comes to co-ops don't relate to small organizations, right? Because I can conceptualize a florist, right, with 5 people working in it. That all kind of makes sense. Where I struggle to conceptualize a co-op is when we're scaling to the companies the size of NASA, right? Or what's Elon Musk's Starship, SpaceX, right?
Yeah.
How do you, or even better than that would be Intel, right? With a $10 trillion plant or $10 billion plant in Malaysia or whatever it is. How do you scale to 100,000 employees, and how do you back the equity required to build, say, one of the world's only chip manufacturing plants? Like, how do you handle the extreme? Like, maybe that's unfair because most people, even in Australia and a lot of other parts of the world, most people work for small business, right? So but the thing is, that's kind of easy to conceptualize. The hard part is these massive organizations. How do you fund this massive organization? How do you organize this massive organization? And then I've got some questions around liability, I suppose, for that organization. So how would you address those concerns?
Yeah. So I think, I mean, when we're talking about, when you think about how one capitalizes an enterprise now of any scale, really, but even at the big scale, it's different forms of the same kind of thing. You raise capital, and either you raise capital by starting small and finding a niche in a market and able to either capture that market or have an outsized influence in that market, so that you're able to generate greater amounts of capital that you then reinvest back into the business in order to grow that business, in the idea of continuing to accumulate the capital in order to be able to fund greater and greater activity. And so that's one. I don't think that in principle that would go away in a sort of cooperative market based system. But otherwise, you have to raise it from the people who already have the capital. And so right now that's banks and capitalists and people with money, and to a certain degree there's some bit, but it's a minority that's raised from sort of general people who are participating in stocks or something like that. So I'll put a flag down in the sense that I am somewhat weary of being super proscriptive, because I do think that one of the benefits of cooperatives in like sort of at its core is that it gives workers a kind of experience in thinking about issues of raising capital, how you'd be able to do that. I think it also allows a sense of experimentation that may develop different ways of doing this that I might not even think of. And so I'm going to sort of be honest with the fact that I have a limited knowledge of what would even be possible if we actually kind of liberated workers to self-organize in a way. But there's essentially there's always going to be a body or a group that is going to be a decision maker in terms of distributing what we now consider capital, but there's a sort of means to be able to do something. And there's going to have to be some kind of criteria in which one is able to access the sort of general capital. So you can think of a system, if you have a cooperative ecosystem, if not a cooperative economy, in which there is a kind of, either through a kind of ethos, there's these things, the Rochdale principles, and one of the these are like the principles that are supposed to guide cooperative developments, and one of them is that co-ops will help co-ops. And one model that's been proposed of doing that is basically a kind of, you might call it a tithe if you're religious, or you could call it a tax, whatever. But the idea is that each co-op would commit some percentage of the profits that they would make, the excess value that they create from their production, to a generalizable fund that would have a cooperative entity, an entity that people could participate in, who would be the decision maker in terms of distributing the excess funds that are contributed to that fund. So this is not super different than like paying into the government and having the government decide, where the money goes. The difference is that this is in a government that's, captured by an elite whose only goal is to maintain their own personal capital accumulation. So the idea, because like if we look at it now, right, you want to start a business, or you want to access capital to do some kind of activity economically, you have to go where the money is. So you have to go to the bank, or you have to seek out investors. And for both of them, the base level justification for giving you the capital, or the money that you can then turn into capital, is a return for the entity that is going to do that, going to give you the money, right? And so you essentially say, look, this is why I think that you should invest in my business, or give me a loan, because I will either be able to repay the loan at terms that allow you an interest return, or that I will be able to eventually give you dividends on the fact that you have an ownership stake in the business. And so that's the kind of model that we use now. And the model is essentially the return on investment principle. The idea being that you'll incentivize investment because people will want a return. And so, and that does work in the sense of, it does allow investment into enterprises, but it also has perverse incentives in the sense that you can get the sort of ruthless pursuit of profits over other principles that might be in some ways more important: ecological, personal, social. So you can have industries that are poisoning rivers or something like that, because they essentially have to choose. And I know in America and in many places there's this principle of the fiduciary duty, which is that to an investor, if an entity has a fiduciary duty to that investor, their duty is to ensure the greatest return for that investor over almost all other concerns, unless that organization is specifically organized in the sense that the fiduciary duty may be secondary to other concerns. This is the, I can't remember what they're called, the C, no, not the C corps, but there's a kind of corporation in the United States that will subsume the fiduciary duty against, like, wanting to, like, decrease poverty or something like that. And so they'll do a primary dividend give to, like, a philanthropic organization, and then distribute whatever's left to shareholders. And so in my view, what you would have is you essentially would disallow that kind of investment, and so you'd need a different set of principles that would sort of justify how an enterprise would be able to access capital. And so I think that I don't, again, I'm somewhat weary to prescribe what those would be, but they would be something like environmental conscious activity that is designed to provide something like the public good, as nebulous as that might be. And so in some ways you have a similar distribution model of capital, in the sense that there's going to be some measure by which you will judge and determine who would get some and who wouldn't get some. And you can think of it as terms of a group of workers, or even a single worker who sort of has an idea for an enterprise. They go to the capital distribution cooperative. They provide a proposal. That proposal, understanding, and you might have even, and I'm not suggesting even a single entity to do this, right? There's lots of different banks. There's like not like a single governmental entity that could capture all of capital, but that you could have a number of different cooperatives a number of different capital distribution cooperatives, of which there exist now. They're called community development financial institutions. And you go to them and you say, this is my, maybe the environmentally focused the community development financial institution, we might just call it the CDFI, you can say, this is what I want. It meets the mission of your CDFI. This is the amount that I think I need in order to begin the business. And I think that eventually I will be able to, this will be, if it's a straight market system, I think that in this market, this will be attractive. People will want to purchase either the commodity or purchase the service that I'm offering. I will then be able to create a kind of surplus on the above and beyond the cost that it will produce that, and then I will commit to returning to this fund, or the generalizable fund that you're ultimately funded by, a certain percentage. And then based on that proposal, there's a cooperative group of people who are interested in doing this, who want to participate in that, who will conduct a debate, hold a vote, and if the vote is successful, the capital is distributed, and the enterprise is told, do your best. And I think in my larger sort of socialist perspective, you would have a system that would, as a sort of guarantee of human rights, guarantee the basic needs of a human being, in terms of access to food, access to housing, access to transportation, access to electricity, and now the internet, and like a sort of basic lowest level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, such that a more entrepreneurial kind of worker can engage in entrepreneurship that we know now, which is coming up with an idea, coming up with an innovative notion. And if there isn't a co-op that they can plug into that is receptive to that idea, and they want to start something new, they have this avenue to be able to do that. And so there are going to be a lot of sort of traditional socialists who will be frustrated by this even proposition, because it sounds a lot like capitalism, in the sense that using the market and having issues of capital distribution and stuff like that. But for me, the real core is who owns and controls the means of production, and what is the kind of basis on which capital is distributed and enterprises are actually governed. And I think that as long as we're in a system that disallows a private person from being the sort of authoritarian, and you're talking about a person who, though is entrepreneurial to the goal of creating a cooperative enterprise where anyone who's participating in that enterprise can participate meaningfully, and doing something that maybe they aren't able to do in a different kind of co-op, then they can do that. And if that co-op fails, then they can, at minimum, they won't lose like their house or the ability to buy food, right? Those are taken care of. And then they can freely associate, and they say, okay, look, I had this idea. I thought it was a good one. I got the ability to try it out. It didn't work. And so I either have to withdraw from the labor market and do nothing, which there might be some people who would do because they're so disillusioned, or cut my losses and find a co-op that already exists that is successful, that I can then freely associate my labor, which is another sort of basic Marxist principle of what it would mean to be in a communist system, is that you'd have a system that was taking care of everyone's kind of basic needs outside of a market system. So it's a distributed kind of human rights system. And then you can freely associate your labor. And that might mean going into a co-op where you can meaningfully participate in the enterprise itself, or attempt to start your own and be able to there be in society mechanisms that would be able to distribute the means by which one would be able to attempt new and innovative activities economically. So I'm not sure. I think the scale, I think, is something I missed. So I think when you're talking about the decision making model, we have examples of attempting to scale democratic participation in our political systems. And so you likely have a federalization and or a republicanization, in the sense of you might create sort of hierarchies of things where you have individual factories that might be more democratic in the sense that like anybody in that factory can participate. And then you might have but in larger factories, because any like large factory, but if you're thinking Walmart or anything like that, you already have in the division of labor divisions in these like large enterprises. And so as you go down to the lowest level in terms of like the quote unquote shop floor, there you're talking about having real horizontal democratic participation, and they may in the course of doing so elect people who might participate at a kind of higher managerial level that would be able to connect and link these organizations to link these different divisions together, so that they could cooperate and they could understand what inputs are needed from whom and what outputs are going to come from what, so that they can use it in different ways. And so it's not actually all that different than, again, corporate structures. That there's been innovation made in organizational theory and practice in terms of needing to in the demand of modern and neoliberal capitalist production to create these large enterprises that are able to do it. The issue has always been that as that federation grows up, it's not from the bottom up, it's usually from the top down. And so in terms of that structure, you just introduce much more voting and cooperation. And I'm personally very, very inclined towards the sociocratic model, which is one in which decisions are made in a very different way than we're not this kind of parliamentary way that we're sort of used to, which is usually just used for the ability to either for the minority to disrupt everything or for the majority to destroy the minority. And so what you want to have is a genuine model of participation where, yes, you might have on the ground these small circles where everyone participates and you get like not necessarily consensus, but consent. And then you can feed that upwards where you'll send a delegate to another circle in which they participate in the same way. And that circle may send a delegate to another circle that is at these different gradations of decision making. And so what you have is the principles of like instant recallability, but also instant communication, so that the decisions that are happening at the top are not done in a black box in the way that they are in terms of corporate structures, in which, even at my own business, I don't know what people even one or two levels above me are doing in terms of decision making or why. I'm just told this is the decision, do your job in that constrained situation. And so again, it's like it's not super different. What we're doing is not totally remaking everything. What we're doing is we're changing the decision-making structure and the principles on which decisions are made. They are not made for individuals who essentially already have power to maintain and in some ways grow their power and increase the ability for them to accumulate larger and larger amounts of capital and and all of that comes with that, but instead provide a means by which genuine participation starts at the ground and maintains all the way up, so that there's transparency, there's predictability, there's democracy, and a greater level of participation. Because I also, and this maybe is a bit of a leap of faith, but I do believe in that democratic principle that if you have people who are informed and who care and participate, that the more those kind of people participate, the better decisions you're going to get. It's when you have a situation in which you have people who are ignorant and not able to see what's actually going on and poorly incentivized, that their participation becomes problematic. And so what I'm trying to do is to come up with these ways in which we can pull levers that increase the proactive and progressive aspects of democracy, so that it can really show its true value, which I don't think that we've seen. I think that democratic systems politically certainly have been captured most of the time by the already existing elite and then constrained so that they continue to serve that elite. I want to throw that off and allow honest, genuine participation in decision making for those people who are affected by it. And corporate decisions affect even the decisions made by Jeff Bezos are felt by the worker on an Amazon distribution floor. And so I believe, as a kind of matter of principle, but also I think as something that would ultimately produce better outcomes, I think that workers should, if they're so inclined, be able to participate. And so that's maybe a long and winding answer, but I think it's to repeat this in some ways, it's not that much different. It's really just the models that we're in some ways used to now, made more democratic.
But how do you like a theme that seems to repeat with your responses is that there's this connection. There's this, I don't know if it's an implied connection, but there's this connection between levels of participation in the decision making process and good outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
How do you know that just because you have more people participating in the decision making process, that you will actually arrive at a good outcome? I can envisage a situation where you have a company, say a co-op, and they're really successful. Maybe they make a product, maybe they make a phone, maybe they make Kev's phone, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this phone is the best phone, right? And it's so good, they destroy all their competition, right? So it's like Nokia all over again or something. So they have the best possible phone, and then the workers in that co-op decide, well, we've got the best phone, so we'll charge the most money for it. So they just start charging more and more money for their product. And because it's the best product, it's the coolest product, everyone wants it. So they have dominance in the market. And then they effectively start probably doing what most businesses do, and they start creating lock-in, where they have an exclusive store where you can only get the apps that you buy from that store, only work on that phone, et cetera, et cetera. It's all these things again. Like, the co-op's in a way, the co-op's responsibility is to make profit for the co-op members, not for society. So how do you know that the decision-making process, even though it's democratized, will actually result in benefits to society and not just the co-op? Like, how do you deal with that?
There's two ways. One is the esoteric and philosophical. The other one is the where the rubber hits the road, as you might say. So maybe to start with the latter one, laws. You could have a situation in which there's still going to be anti-monopoly laws, things that incentivize competition, or things that essentially demand competition. You could envision a situation in which you are essentially you won't have access to capital or even markets if you engage in anti-competitive activity. Again, so not so much different than we have in sort of even neoliberal capitalism, even though that's decreased, maybe progressive capitalism you might call it. So you could simply have a legal structure that disallows that kind of decision making. So that would be the one that's like assuming that incentive, the incentives that you're talking about are still operable in a cooperative. And I agree that with cooperatives that are existing in a capitalist market, a market that has those incentives, that that's a tendency. And so maybe in terms of the progression away from the capitalist established free market mechanisms and incentives, you might need a situation in which there are these limits, legal limits on that constrain those potentially sort of bad incentives. The more esoteric and philosophical is that the drive towards monopolization is a drive that is inherent in capitalist systems because the goal of capitalism ultimately is the accumulation, is capital accumulation. That's the end in itself for capitalism. And so because capitalism isn't interested in even making, like, the point of the capitalist enterprise that makes a phone is to make the best phone only for the purposes of continuing to extract as much value as they possibly can. And so that's the incentive of a capitalist organization and of an individual capitalist or a group of capitalists organized as a corporation. If you're talking about an economy that is fundamentally different and not fundamentally based on private ownership of the means of production for the purposes of surplus value extraction from laborers, and also whatever means that you have to increase the amount of capture you have in a market, so market manipulations and advertising and all these kinds of things. But you have an economic organization that's fundamentally based on worker participation, and again, you're not even able to start or fund enterprises that don't have some kind of goal that isn't purely capital accumulation. The goal, so if you're talking about a cooperative that makes a phone, their bylaws, the articles of incorporation of the business, whatever you like, however that actually lays out what the structure is going to be in terms of how decisions are made and what the ultimate goal of the organization is. In articles of incorporation right now in capitalism, you don't have to specifically say that the goal is accumulation of capital because it's assumed. But in a cooperative incentive where you have disallowed private ownership of the means of production, you're going to have to state clearly what the goal of the enterprise is. And so if we're talking about a goal of an enterprise to make phones, it will be to make the best phone at the cheapest price or something like that, right? It's or the best phone for the environment, or right, there's always going to be this relationship between the commodity or service you provide and what it is you're trying to accomplish by providing that. And that's going to be the model in which the CDFI, the Community Development Financial Institution, is going to actually invest and allow you to engage in your activity. So I do think that those two things will connect, and they'll have to, that you're going to, it's a real change of ethos, because this is a situation in which, just like the fundamental reason why you engage in an enterprise in capitalism is different than why people engaged in enterprises in a feudal system. I mean, it is remaking how we understand our relationship to production itself. And so this long process, this what I would call the revolutionary process of moving from capitalism into socialism, in that difficult period of trying to wrestle away from the notions and the cultural positions and the economic motivations of capitalism into a new system in which the economic, social, and cultural motivations are, I would say, truly human, or potentially just actually living out the ideals of equality, fraternity, liberty, and maybe solidarity, that you're going to change people. in some ways, that we as human beings, this goes back to again deep philosophical positions on issues of human nature and things like that. But in my perspective, and I think a pretty traditional Marxist perspective, is that human beings are mammals, and we are shaped by our evolutionary history for sure, and we carry that baggage. But we have also shown ourselves as the only mammal that can live in every single like place on the globe and outside of it, in terms of living in low Earth orbit, and eventually we'll be on the moon and Mars. That we are a highly adaptable species. Now we have to breathe air, and there's some constraints for sure, and we have an evolutionary heritage. We have, parts of our brain are too active. The rational part is not active enough, and the deep lizard brain is probably too active, and so we do have issues. But we've shown ourselves to be highly adaptable, and much of that adaptation is due to our ability for technological advancement. And so and in that process, I mean, if you were somehow thrust back in time to ancient Rome, there's going to be things that you recognize because we're still humans, but a lot of it's just going to, like, these people are just different. They don't, they're just, it's almost like a different species, because things are so different. And so, but it's less so between the late feudal person who lives in late feudal system and a person who lives in sort of the middle of capitalism, right? Those are a bit closer of a connection, and that's why I don't want us to think that we're just like remaking everything, and that we have like this utopian notion that we can just snap our fingers and everybody will be different. No, it's a long process, but that has happened in the past, and I think necessity will demand that it happens in the future. I mean, it's going to be a question as to whether or not we are going to, as ancient Rome did and other civilizations, and the Aztec Empire and stuff like that, just run up against the limits of our social, economic, and cultural and political system, and to the common ruin of that system, or if we're going to realize that we can build upon what we've done and really and make it quote unquote better. And I think to your point about how do I know that the decisions of a more democratically organized organization are going to be better than the those of one that might be more autocratic or even authoritarian. And I would say that it's going to depend on what we mean by better. What are those decisions? I do think it tends to be the case that, one, if you're organizing people based on something other than the ruthless pursuit of private gain, of sort of individual self-interest, which is, again, a core deep value of our current system. You have the Ayn Rands of the world who will talk about the virtue of selfishness, and that, the Adam Smiths of the world by saying, yeah, everybody just has to pursue their own self-interest, and magically through the invisible hand of a market system that will get everything that we need. I think that we do sort of quite obviously see the limitations of that being the grounding force of why we're engaged in things. And so if you establish a kind of new ground ethos in which it isn't our self-interest that is going to motivate our decision making, but the actual sort of common good, and that we engender that over the course of even potentially generations, what you will see at the outset of that long and difficult process is people that have genuinely taken on the value that my own self-interest, though inexorably linked, is not the primary motivation for my decision making, particularly economically or politically. That what my goal is to look towards is the sort of common good. And I think it's this, again, it's the irony of most Marxists and most socialists is that we're really arguing that the philosophical and the kind of high ideals of the Enlightenment, of rationality and equality and liberty and the ability for people to sort of genuinely participate in ways that, again, a feudal person would just think is not possible for human beings, are real goals, are goals that we should strive for. And that though capitalism and liberalism and sort of bourgeois democratic republics and things like that promised those, they have quite obviously not delivered them. And so what can we do to change those systems in order for them to deliver them? And I think what we have seen, what I would argue, is that you have this major contradiction between the economic system being based primarily on self-interest, selfishness, and private accumulation, and a quote-unquote public system that is attempting to be for the public good and increasing these high ideals of equality, liberty, solidarity, and fraternity, that those are in conflict with one another. And because, again, as a Marxist, the economics are the base, the relationships in production, how things are produced, that mode of production is the thing that rests as the foundation, and the legal system and social system and cultural system kind of is the superstructure on top of that. That because the political systems that we have created that have attempted to realize the public good are resting on top of a fundamentally oppressive and exploitative relationship, and an economic model that is fundamentally motivated and predicated on self-interest serving and accumulating profits, accumulating capital based on the exploitation of other human beings' labor, that supersedes any of the high ideals of our social, cultural, political system. And so what we need to do is change our economic system, change those core values that undergird our economic system. And so our economic system should also adopt the core values of common good and democratic participation. And if they do, I think that then when we say, why would we assume that they would make that democratic decisions would make better decisions? It's because those two things would be aligned in a way that they're not now. It's in my view why China does so good at capitalism, is because authoritarianism and capitalism are much easier to work with than genuine democracy and capitalism, because they are working on fundamentally different principles. So what do you think about that?
It's interesting. It's interesting because there is like basically I don't want to be unfair. Basically, the summation of what I heard in regards to knowing that a business can make good decisions that are in the interest of society and not just necessarily in the co-op or the people there or the people who are running the show, is that we just have to believe that a better system with which that business operates under will result in better outcomes.
And we need to provide the incentives to do so. I mean, I fundamentally
Yeah,
at core believe that human beings are essentially sort of incentive. We want to find the path of least resistance and make our lives as sort of easy as possible. But we're going to do that in a situation of constraints, right? We have a situation of scarcity, which is why we have this whole field of economics, and we're not, we can't just do everything that we want to do. We've got technological constraints and we've got different constraints. So we are then forced to create incentives. And what are the incentives that we do? And if we incentivize, which I think we do in this system, greed, capriciousness, self-interest, and thinking about yourself more than anybody else, and that lead into things like the conscious, you'll have somebody who screws over somebody in business who like would feel bad about it, except for they've got this conscience cover of saying, well, look, it's only business, buddy. Like, hey, this is just a game we're playing, right? And it's not. It's people's actual lives and the scarce resources that we have, and so we can't. What become essentially, if you think about the goal of providing something like equal access to the basic needs of society, or the basic needs of a human being, the ability to like genuinely freely decide how you're going to engage with the world. If these are like the things that we want to prop up, which I think it's pretty common that, I think most people are down with that. I mean, I can't be totally sure, but I would wager that would be what most people would want out of a system. It's why it's what people use as the justification for capitalism, assuming that it does that. What we have in our economic system and even the cultural, political, and social system that rests on top of that economic system is a whole slew of disincentives to reach that goal. And what actually happens is the incentives are much more towards private gain and conscience cover and these kind of things that result in ecological, social, cultural, political destruction. And I think that, I mean, it might sound a little negative, but I'll be that way for a second. We are in a situation where we are staring down a major ecological crisis that we are, especially in the United States, but I would argue in Australia and in all over the world, looking at social and cultural and political collapse in many places, if not degradation. And so this sort of underlying system is not getting us towards the goals that I think most human beings agree is the point of economic organization, which is to maybe in that core utilitarian model, provide the greatest good for the greatest number of people. If that is the case, I think we can all agree that there's at least a few things that we could do that would fundamentally change the incentive structure that would allow us to more quickly get us get us towards that direction, and if nothing else, slow the ecological, social, cultural, and political degradation that I think we're seeing.
One of the, I don't like this might feel like a change in subject, but it's not. It's still along the lines of decision making and management purview. If you look at some of the statistics for businesses, why they fail and where they go wrong, there's a lot of different voices out there that talk about it, but there's a common thread that the business rates or business success rate over years is pretty consistent, and it doesn't seem to matter what the economic situation is. So it's roughly 20% of businesses fail in the first year, 30% fail in the second year, 50% have failed by year 5, and 70% have failed by year 10.
Most businesses fail.
Most businesses do fail over the long term.
Yeah.
Some people would say that that's not a good thing, but I'm not necessarily convinced that that's true, because it could be, certainly under the capitalistic system, if you can't make your books balance, if you can't produce a product, find a market, produce the product, whether it's virtual product or like a physical product, whatever it is, combs or software or whatever. If you can't do that within a budget and make a profit so that you can expand, then you're going to fail, right? So a proponent of capitalism would argue that capitalism is the testing ground of ideas, right? And not only your idea, but your ability to market, distribute, and sell and produce your idea, right? So it could be viewed that capitalism is like a evolutionary battleground of ideas, right? When it comes to products and services. And certainly I think you could make the conclusive claim that it is efficient, right? So from a purely monetary point of view, it's very efficient, because if you can't produce the product and market it and sell it and make a profit, then your business is going to die. So you have to be productive and you have to be profitable, notwithstanding, perverse government incentives or things like that, right? So like when we have subsidies for coal plants and stuff, all that sort of bollocks that we shouldn't have at all. One of the issues I can see with the government incentivized co-op system is you might be inadvertently, I could envisage a situation where you would inadvertently extend a small company's adolescent period where they're inefficient and do things the wrong way in the sake of bettering society. So in other words, if you say that your mandates for your co-op is we're going to make society better because we're going to provide gardens all around the cities where people can share, small gardens where people can grow food, right? So I was in a co-op that did this actually in a different suburb that I was living in. It was quite cool.
Mm-hmm.
And their mandates to do that. Well, conceivably they could run really inefficiently because they're receiving quote unquote perverse incentives from the government or what other body to do that. And is that the outcome we really want? It's hard to know if that would be on balance the right outcome. And I guess it's not a question. I guess I'm just posting the thought to you. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, and so the question would be: is efficiency the sort of end in itself? Is that the means by which we should judge the success of an enterprise? I think that for some, it's going to be, this recognition that we've got constraints, we've got resource constraints, and so we need to be able to utilize those resources in the most cost effective way. Let's say, I do think that you do bring in the issues of sort of disincentives in the sense that, again, the access to that capital and the reason why you even get the incentive to invest in or provide a loan to or provide the initial capital for an enterprise to start is this notion that you will that business will generate more than it costs to produce and provide you a return. So that model is one of the core creations of disincentives that may produce efficiency, but efficiency for the purposes of individual enrichment. And so you come into that will juxtapose questions of efficiency with equality, or maybe dare I say equity. That's a loaded term, but the idea that is our value. Are we going to say we're going to accept potentially significant amount of inequality in order to realize sort of ruthless efficiency? And what does that efficiency ultimately mean? What it usually means, at least what it means in capitalism, is that because a lot of things, like there's many inputs are fixed because you can't change the price of things. And so the two ways that you're able to realize greater amounts of profit, or the excess between how the cost of production and the price at sale at the market, is either decreasing the cost of labor or essentially manipulating the market to be able to out compete your competitors. And so both of them produce, I would say, poor results, because the decrease in the cost of labor, you may suggest would come at the point of automation, but again, in a capitalist system, you need people who make money to buy products. And so the rate of profit that you're going to get on each individual commodity with every increase in the efficiency of your labor, whether that be through automation or even decreasing the amount of money that the laborer gets, the actual ability to realize actual profits is going to decrease, partially because you're not giving the people who need to buy the commodity or the service that you're producing the means to actually do it. And so you're going to run into a crisis point in which you've overproduced because you can't actually sell the thing. But then the market manipulations are going to, again, distort the market the same way that the government does, that I agree with you could be problematic, in the sense that you're not putting into a situation what we assume in economics, that the consumer has a kind of perfect information and that there's perfect competition and things like that, because the way that you're able to, the incentive that you have as the individual producer of the commodity or the provider of the service, is to essentially use advertising or other ways to limit the exposure of your competitors and increase the awareness of your brand or whatever it is. That is essentially a market distortion. And so you're providing a situation in which there is this disequilibrium between the sort of the way that we understand in the abstract how a capitalist system is supposed to work, and how it actually does in terms of what the incentive structure actually is at the bottom. And so I would be happy in some ways to be inefficient with in situations in which potentially our resource constraints are not as high, if in those situations um, we can promote other values that we might see as higher or greater, or what we ought to see as more important than efficiency. And so, something like automation. I mean, I think automation, in the sense, is like a means of getting super efficient, and that's good. But if that doesn't result in a sort of change in the relations of production between human beings and not only production but even consumption, then it's really just a means by which to hyper exploit individuals and to increase the level of inequality. So if our goal in society is to increase equality, increase access for individuals to participate meaningfully, automation could be something that we don't want to do. Now, we want to do that because we want to efficiently use resources. So we're going to have to change, we're going to have to adopt a universal basic income that forces the individual in a capitalist system to forego greater and greater amounts of the value that they can generate in the system, so that it can provide the consumer the means to actually produce it. I think that that's ultimately inefficient, and that what you could get into a situation in which this distribution of money is kind of not necessary. And that is already moving us into a different kind of economic paradigm. I think that the movement away from capitalism into something else is inevitable. It is already happening, specifically with the technological revolution that we're sort of going through. And you got people who are arguing essentially that we're regressing into a kind of techno-feudal age, and I think there's something to that. But it is also, if we're engaged in a political, social, economic process that would be able to change these incentives and construct different means by which people relate to what they do in a more democratic manner and stuff like that, you could use automation to greatly increase efficiency without in the same way that we see sort of capitalism doing, without the negative externalities, as they're called, that we see in the capitalist system. And so in terms of the capitalism being, I mean, I think there's a confusion between markets and what markets do and capitalism, because markets predate capitalism. And so markets and capitalism are often conflated, and they're not the same thing. Capitalism is the mode of production. It's how we decide how things are produced, where they're produced, who does the producing, and what's done with the profits that are made, or the value that's created through that work. The way that they're distributed is a different question. And so that's why you have like socialists who say, look, you just need workers to own and control the means of production, and then they can participate in a market, and they're market socialists. And you've got other people who say, well, no, the market has actually been more problematic, and maybe you have super constrained markets, but you might have more just sort of straight distribution. Again, even like in the Roman Empire, there was a bread dole that you got food. The food was a guarantee, even to like everyone in Rome. But they had markets. They had, slave markets and things that we've already realized that we want to constrain our markets in a capitalist system. And so I think that markets can be an efficient way to figure out how you should distribute what's produced. But that's not capitalism. Capitalism is this system of employer-employee relations in which an individual who owns and controls capital is able to employ that capital by paying people for their labor, and then extracting out of that labor more than they're paying them to do that labor. That's the core thing that I find problematic, that I think we need to change. I'm somewhat agnostic about markets. I think what you really want are really constrained markets, that the constraints should be created in a democratic, cooperative manner, but I think markets can be efficient. I agree with you on that. There is a kind of evolutionary process to be able to see who works and who doesn't. And I agree that you don't want to just have like, even like how you're accessing capital. If you are wasting scarce resources, you should not be allowed to get more capital. And you're going to have control mechanisms, CDFIs and governments as we might know it. But these are community cooperatives or something like that, who would basically say to seriously wasteful enterprises, guys and gals, it's not working. You're not fulfilling your job. You're not doing it in an efficient manner. You're not, this is not working out. And you might have that same institution say, look, you're not as efficient probably as you could be if you were more ruthlessly exploiting the labor of your people, but we're not incentivizing the exploitation of the labor of your people. So it's all right. You can, there's a certain amount of, just as we've accepted in the capitalist system, this kind of notion of creative destruction, we can say, well, we're gonna accept a bit of inefficiency in some systems because there's other goals that are higher than that. I don't think that that's sort of impossible or even super whimsical or utopian. I think that it's a question of what we're going to incentivize in our systems. And so yeah, I think that we that the point of understanding the mode of production and the relations of production that come from that, in terms of, a lot of consequences in terms of this division between employer and employee, and there's a lot of negative consequences, and I think that we could, again, rather easily adjust that mode of production without having to really do a huge amount, even at the outset, even of changing the mode of distribution and the mode of consumption. But I would also want there to be more cooperative and democratic control over consumption and distribution, to be able to say that, just as we have accepted here, that there are going to be some things that are just not, we're not going to have a market for them, and I think that, as we decided with slavery and other things, I mean, those are, that is potentially a commodity market that we have said morally in most ways we're just not going to accept. We can continue to do that, and we can still have a market system that can have all of the benefits that I think you've identified, but that don't have all the consequences of the mode of production that creates these disincentives towards realizing, again, maybe just even crudely, the utilitarian goal of the greatest good for the greatest number, but higher goals like solidarity amongst people, genuine political participation, and hopefully not a perfectly equal, but a more equitable society.
Do you think ultimately we need to be able to balance the books at a governmental level? Do we need to be able to produce more than we spend? Or do you think we can just do you think we can continue spending forever?
So I recently wrote a paper, I'm fishing it around, talking about something like Mars, the Mars settlement, and comparing it to Earth. And on Earth, you have a situation where we do ultimately have a situation of scarcity. We know that there's only so much oil, there is only so much water, there is only so much helium. We know that. However, it's a lot of abundance. So it's a kind of, this is intentionally ironic, abundant scarcity. If you're looking at Mars, it's not. It's acute scarcity. There's, air is at a premium. Arable land is zero right now. You have to make it, right? So this is a situation in which there's kind of an acute scarcity. In a situation of acute scarcity, the demands for even a more authoritarian style of what I would call socialism, from each according to their need, to each according to their, from each according to their ability, to each according to their need, is almost a mandate on Earth, because there is this kind of abundant scarcity. We have even accepted in our capitalist system that there's going to be waste, and that we can kind of accept some wastage because we have this abundance. So as that being said, in principle, again, as technology develops, we may be able to find out in the universe and out in the solar system the resources in a way that pulls us out of this inherent scarcity. I mean, even in food production, and I think in energy production and things like that, we are, and I think it's generally accepted, in a kind of post-scarcity situation. So, in the need to balance the books, and that core value of saying, look, it is inefficient and unsustainable to use more than you produce. That kind of at minimum you need to be at a balance, and better off to like use less than you can get out of it. Sure, I think that there is a basic principle that you need to use the resources that you have available to you in the most efficient way. But I think you can add a caveat that says, so long as you aren't going to, that in the pursuit of doing that, you are not going to, that you're not going to violate other values. And those other values, I might propose someone else might propose a list of others. And I think we should have an avenue and a place in which we can discuss that, and to say which are these values that we're gonna agree are the most important. And I would wager, and I don't know it for sure, but I would wager that in a situation where you could get people together, we would accept some inefficiencies for the pursuit of goals like equity and solidarity. And but I don't want to be like flippant or mistake the point. For the most part, yes, you want to have a situation in which there's at least enough incentive to say we're not just going to piss away valuable resources, and that there's going to have to be the necessity for more efficiency in production and distribution for more scarce resources than there will be for less scarce resources. And so the level of inefficiency and sort of not balancing the books that we would be able to accept would be greater in situations that allow for it, that if we were less so wouldn't lead to environmental collapse or something like that.
The reason, it's interesting you say that. The reason I asked the question is we have this scary situation in the US where you have. Are you Canadian or are you American?
I'm American, unfortunately.
American. Okay, sorry.
Canadian.
Sorry, I can't always tell the difference.
Live like 3 hours from the border, right? It's okay.
Sure. It is an amazing place. I've been to Canada a few times. It's
Quebec
beautiful.
Quebec is even, like, to me, it's like an even special,
Sure.
like a little special place in Canada for sure.
So you have this scary situation where the levels of debt that your country has is record breaking, and it increases every year. Mm-hmm. And there's this outstanding question of, is that sustainable? Can you sustain that? How does this work going into the future? Do you eventually need to pay all that back? This isn't a problem that we have as strongly in Australia at all. For the most part, our GDP and all this stuff and our imports and exports are a lot more balanced. And even though we're very socially democratic, is that the right word? SocDem? Yeah. We have robust healthcare systems and government assistance and education, and a lot of it's subsidized. And we do make we already make these sacrifices to efficiency, in that we subsidize a lot of things. We subsidize healthcare, we subsidize medications, we subsidize government, the transport system. You pay $2 to get on the bus to go to the city, mm-hmm. when the actual real world cost might be $6, right, per trip. So we already have these we already have, specifically in Australia, a lot of inefficiencies in the system in the name of pursuing things that are good and fair and reasonable, right? And I don't actually have a problem with that at all. I think it's actually better than not. But there's an outstanding question of, do you actually need to spend less than you earn, right, as a governmental situation? And traditional logic and reason and I don't know what the term is, but traditional views on that would be, no, you definitely need to be able to balance the books, as we're talking about. Another view that I'm very skeptical of is that we could just keep borrowing forever. But the reason it's important, and hearkening back to the composition of co-ops and how management structures work and how financing works and all that sort of stuff. If you have, and this harkens back to another statement you made earlier, where you would want to accept some levels of inefficiencies in the system in order to achieve the outcomes you're looking for. if you have, there's a certain amount of the population of the workforce that will be government employed, right? And so in most Western democracies, USA, Australia, New Zealand, UK, Canada, it's around about 20%, as I understand it. It's around about 20%. 20% of the people that work for state, federal governments, local municipalities, whatever.
Mhm.
And so they don't make a profit. They have to be subsidized by the people who do make a profit. No, so you've got 80% of the workforce, roughly, very roughly, depending on the country you're in, and it's more social. It's higher the more socially democratic you become. So a lot of the Scandinavian countries, it's about 30%. Cuba is the highest at about 70 something percent. So the companies that make a profit need to be able to subsidize the government funded organizations, right? And there's this, it's not really a question, it's just like a topic for discussion, because we already subsidize quite a lot, even in the modern day society, much so more in Australia than in America.
Mm-hmm.
You need companies that will be profitable in order to subsidize the ones that aren't profitable in the private sector, plus the government, right? So the more organizations that you have that are co-ops, that are running at a loss or are running, effectively they're running at a loss. If you're producing, if you're only earning $10 million a year as an organization with 100 employees, and it costs you $12 million a year to run, then that money has to come from somewhere. Traditionally speaking, I'll accept that. From a traditional point of view, that money's got to come from somewhere, right?
Mm-hmm.
So on balance, how do you make this work, right? So if you, and we seem to have found an equilibrium that fits in Australia, although it's a capitalist system. But it's definitely not a socialist system.
Yep.
How do you make this work? Because you already have this 20% that's government, and then you have a lot of systems that are for the greater good, not for profit. And the whole focus of this system that you're talking about switches from profit-based system to the betterment of mankind. How do you balance the books then? Because you need a large portion of the workforce to work for companies that are for profit, in my mind, in order to balance out the ones that are not for profit and the government. So how do you make this work?
I think that the going back to the mode of production, the sort of capitalist mode of production, when you think about that, the relations of that production are that you have an employer who then pays people, and they pay people, the traditional determination of the extraction of surplus, or the ability to extract surplus value, is that in an 8-hour shift, 4 hours of the work that is being done creates enough value to pay for the 8 hours that of the wage that's paid for the 8 hours, and then 4 of those hours are just value that is extracted by the owner of the business, the capitalist. So in that mode of surplus value extraction, it is social production, so like a number of individuals, and it's private extraction. You can come up with a situation, and it's only agreed to in conditions of a commodity market, in a labor market, and so it's subject to all the incentives and disincentives of market conditions. In a cooperative system, in a way in which you're freely able to engage in that, you are not being essentially sort of forced to choose the wage that you're getting because of market conditions, how many other people are willing to take less than you are, and all that kind of stuff. What you're doing is that you're associating in a way that says, I'm agreeing to the fact that I am not going to realize the absolute full value of my labor, that I am that as a bargaining chip for the ability to freely associate. I know that a portion of my value is still going to be surplus value, that I'm not going to get the full value of my labor. However, I am consciously engaged in that activity, and I know what the rate of it is because I have, as a worker in that enterprise, the ability to determine that rate. So then you're not in a non-profit system, if that's still what we consider creating profit, right? Still being able to generate value above and beyond what I'm getting as the individual worker that's going to the enterprise, and the enterprise decides what it wants to do with it. Now, I can realize that at the market level, and the issue there is that you're still potentially going to get into issues of overproduction, but you could probably lessen those issues because you have, again, constrained markets and ways that would be able to disincentivize the tendency for overproduction. But you're still in a situation in which you have enterprises whose goal is to participate in a kind of in commodity production, because you're going to hear a lot of people, a lot of socialists will say like, oh, we want to get rid of the commodity form. That's something that Marx even said or something like that. I think that's a very far in the future once you've established a lot of different things, and that's not really my focus right now, because I think you're still going to need to make stuff that people are going to want to get. But the way that you relate to it is going to be much different, and that's what I'm interested in. And so you're having a situation where you have social production that is socially extracting the surplus value for the purposes of funding potentially either inefficient or necessary services. So I think that in the same way that we have a kind of forced taxation system that demands that if you're making a kind of profit that you have to distribute, I want that to be more not based on force and coercion, but based on, again, the reestablishment at your economic base of a set of principles that says, much like the Rochdale principles, it'd be worthwhile to read about the Rochdale principles, but like that as a commitment to our enterprise, especially a kind of successful enterprise in which we are able to kind of realize rates of return that we didn't expect, that the goal of that is not to merely provide for our self-interest, but that as part of the commitment of doing what we're doing, we're going to do that for the purposes of realization of the public good, whatever, as nebulous as that means. And so we're going to give 20% or 30% of our, or 50% of the surplus value that we create into CDFIs or into a general fund that can then equitably distribute to CDFIs to be able to allow other people to do it, or to be able to fund other co-ops that are doing things for which we find valuable that may not be able to realize that value in the market system, in the commodity market system that we're participating in. And so I don't think that you're going to ever, you're not going to get out of this, especially not in the short term, not in maybe what we call socialism. Maybe you can move out of that when you get into like a real communist system, but we can talk about the constraints of socialism. That you're going to have a continuation of surplus value extraction, but it's not going to be coercive and authoritarian, but it's going to be democratic and agreed to. In that situation, that removes the alienation, the other, I think, inhuman aspects of the extraction of surplus value for the private gain of the individual capitalist, and it removes the ability for individuals to have outsized political influence and all that kind of stuff that is leading in many ways, in my view, to the degradation of our social, political, economic, cultural system. So it's not as different as maybe I think as a lot of especially younger socialists will talk about. But when you really think about how these how this transition to something different and better, and something even beyond social democracy, which I think is actually a maintenance of capitalism. It's a kind of buying the exploited labor force by saying, hey, look, we can give you like good enough stuff so that you won't try to remake the economic base. And while I think it's like better for the individual, in Australia than it is in the United States of America, if our ultimate goal is to realize some of the major contradictions and consequences of the capitalist mode of production, you ironically, and it sounds strange, but don't want social democracy. You want to see those contradictions come out. You want to see the sort of ruthless extraction of surplus value and the realization of that for individuals, so that and all the piss poor consequences thereof. So, but because what we want is we want to remake that economic base, because we can still maintain a system in which we have commodity production, service provision, and surplus value creation, but that the surplus value is not extracted by private individuals so that they can either get taxed or engage in philanthropic, meaning their own pet projects, but that we can shift some of that excess value creation by efficient production and, I would say, democratic decision making, and some of the things that I think you would actually realize greater amounts of surplus value, that you'll still be able to provide the funds and the capital that would be necessary to allow public good entities like healthcare and transportation systems and things like that, as well as potentially less efficient systems, so that we can handle some of those inefficient systems because we want to realize those benefits. I think that I just want to go back to the idea that what I'm really focused on is just that mode of production. I think that even surplus value extraction, it's private surplus value extraction that is one of the problems and one of the things that I want to address. It's not the creation of surplus value itself. I think that that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think that's a good thing. But it's who's creating the surplus value and who decides what to do with that. That's really where it matters. And I just want that to be a cooperative.
I really appreciate all the time you've given me, and your responses have been really fantastic. I really appreciate it.
And I know that
one of the things I love,
probably a lot that we want to talk about, and so I'm more than happy to do part 3, part
so
4,
many,
part whatever with you.
Yeah, there's so many more questions.
For sure.
One of the things that I love to do when I'm having discussions with someone who's good faith like yourself is to ask them, what is the most problematic thing about your worldview? Like what is the biggest problem? And so when you ask, if you're dealing with, say, an honest anarcho-capitalist, if they're honest, they will say child protection, right? This is the biggest problem with my system. I don't know how we protect children under an anarcho-capitalist system, right? And so I know you're running out of time, and I am too, because I've got a doctor's appointment in about an hour. But what's the biggest problem? Maybe I asked this already before. What's the biggest problem that you see in your worldview, like in your ultimate outcome? Like, what's the hardest problem to solve, or what is the most problematic thing that you don't think will work, or you still don't have an answer for, or that makes you the most uncomfortable? Like, what's the hardest thing?
That's a great question. I think the hardest thing is, maybe this is a cop out, and it's a good question. It might be a great way to start part 3, but I think the process by which people's perspective is changed is multifaceted. It can be, I think, with potentially good faith actors, through conversation and through dialogue and interaction, and that you can really change people's minds. But I think what really changes people's minds is when their conditions change. And I think one of the most problematic aspects of my position is that I ultimately think that the necessity of the change that I would argue for is not visible to a majority of the people that would be the actors that would bring about that change until a major crisis hits. So
I was just about to say, you're absolutely right. Because quality of life is high, especially in Western democracies that have employed social democracy, government welfare systems and incentives and all sorts of stuff, free education, free healthcare, universal healthcare. That's a major one, I think, for the United States. If you only had that, a lot of the heat would come out of the political situation.
Absolutely. And I don't, as we stare down the barrel of climate change and its consequences, and I think as we see, particularly in the United States, a significant degradation in our political system, a tearing apart of our of our kind of cultural and social fabric and things like that, that there is a tendency, or there is an absolute potential of there being a kind of too little too late, in which what we are getting out of the system that we have feels for enough people like enough, and that you will not get that critical mass until you have a major breakdown. And like I was saying at the beginning, there's nothing inherently progressive about the movement of history. It's absolutely possible that you collide with the consequences and the sort of realization of the contradictions of a system without having the means by which to overcome it. And what comes out of that is really negative, is much more negative than even the kind of maintenance of a system that has significant contradictions. And so, 100 years ago, Rosa Luxemburg, a little over 100 years ago, Rosa Luxemburg had come up with a phrase that's been very common, which is, it's kind of a socialism or barbarism question. And I think that as we entered World War I, it seemed like, barbarism was winning. But you had the potential of a revolutionary movement away from, ruthless imperialist capitalism by the Russian Revolution, and the failure of the German Revolution kind of put a kibosh on that. And so you've had we've had a long stirring situation that has not been stirring for enough people, that has made us I don't want to be fatalistic, and I don't want to be nihilistic. I still have hope, but I think that because of the way that human beings are, our deep evolutionary heritage, and not that we don't have the capacity to change, but much of the time in much of our historical development, what has caused us to make major changes are significant crises. And we have not had a world system like we've had capitalism and industrial development and technological development. And so we've never been having to stare down a world cataclysmic event. And I think, I don't know if you've heard of the movie that's on Netflix, Don't Look Up, but the idea of a comet coming to the world, a kind of world-destroying comet, and people it was not rising to the moment, and essentially it destroys the world, except for I won't give it away, but it's a world-destroying event. And I think it's supposed to be a kind of analogy or a metaphor for climate change. And I think it isn't just climate change. It's the consequences of a lot of different things. And as you have a child and I have a young child, I don't want them to have to face the consequences of things that they didn't decide. And if they had the choice, they would have made a different choice. But that we and our parents and grandparents didn't step up to the moment and make the changes that are needed. And so it does feel like a cop-out. I want to be more self-critical, but I do think that we can't assume that we're just going to have good conversations like this one that are going to convince people. I'm thrilled by the people that have listened to this podcast and potentially had their mind changed. I've heard from people or even just been educated on a different idea, and I've been heartened by that. And I'll do a shameless promotion of, like, you can support the podcast at patreon.com, Sensible Socialist. But at the same time, I'm not sure it will be enough, but I will rest with as much positivity as I can on my deathbed, knowing that at least I tried to move the ball forward, and at least I was able to have good conversations with somebody like you to explore these ideas and to think about what it would take to remake things, and not arguing, as some of the younger comrades might, that we just need to burn everything down. We don't. It's going to get burnt down. What we need to do is build on top of. And so if anyone, even listens to this and says, yeah, you know what, it's not about tearing the world down, it's about building it up, then at least it's been worthwhile.
Thanks so much for your time, mate. I really appreciate it.
For sure. And
It's
like
been
I
a
said,
pleasure.
anytime, you want to, if you got more questions, you've got good questions. You are also a good faith.
Have I?
Yeah. And you're a good faith interlocutor. I think it's really great. It's a conversation that brings a lot of light without so much heat, which I think is good, and unfortunately may not be the most sexy in competing with the others, but I think it's well worth it. And so I deeply
Well, there wasn't any drama, but the problem is that when I ask my questions, I try and put myself in the person I'm asking the questions of and say, assuming this person has good faith, how they're going to respond. Like what's a good question, not what's a drama inducing question or something that's going to start a fight.
Yep. And
But something that's actually going to draw out some meaning from the question.
I will take a 3-hour conversation that's in good faith rather than 15 minutes of bullshit. Even if the 15 minutes gets more views or whatever, that's not the goal. The goal is to have good conversations, and I count you among the people for which those are absolutely possible. So thank you.
Sure. But I do apologize. I monopolized all the questions, so maybe next time you can ask me some questions, and that'll be fine. But I don't. As a centrist and one who supports social democracy, I don't, there's a lot of things I think we're going to agree on a lot more stuff than we disagree on. Is the problem. So
I completely agree with that. Yeah. All right, man. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much for your time. All the best. Happy New Year.
Yeah, you too, man.
See you, mate.
See you later.
Cheers, bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Sensible Socialist podcast. This podcast is supported by listeners like you, and no advertisements or anything will ever be said. If you want to support the podcast, please go to patreon.com/sensiblesocialist and give today. Also, please give us a review or a rating on iTunes or wherever you listen to the podcast, as it greatly helps. All right. See you next time.